2 years ago, I told a story about Eric and Derek. They had a bonkers idea that bringing a level on board a jet would tell you something about the curvature, or lack thereof, of the surface of the Earth. They made a wacky assertion about pilots having to constantly lower the nose of the craft in order to avoid constantly gaining altitude due to curvature, if there was the rate of curvature asserted by the Globies.
Sorry, boys, I have to push the nose down to deal with the curve. What are you talking about? Guys, we're going 500 fucking miles per hour. There's 8 inches per mile squared down there. I have to buckle this thing down a couple hundred feet, in a fraction of a second.
So I put together a detailed response. Early on, I took a quick stroll through the basics of aerodynamics and the angles involved during flight. I guess I wasn't clear on one particular point in part 1, so I'll give it another shot with preference for brevity. Once up to cruising speed and altitude, a plane does not trim its nose downward in order to fly at constant altitude. There are other ways to reduce lift coming from the wings. How about just dropping the engine power? If a speedboat out on a lake is towing a couple of 100 pounds of bricks on skis, and the boater decides to stop, what happens to the bricks? Same with a plane. 2 years ago, I also covered the broader points of electronic navigation and ground-assisted guidance. This is where we propose to use some well-known, long-established technology to reveal the shape of the surface of the Earth. If you haven't yet seen it, this would be the time. Right now. It's all about using the GlideScope radar signals and some basic trigonometry. After plugging the test scenario into my flight simulator, we found that the numbers coming out of it were nowhere near any of the expected figures. That left the need for a real-world pilot to come forward and send me some videos of their approaches. Well, just over a year later, one brave hero stepped forward. He lives in Spain, and he sent me footage from his approaches to Copenhagen as well as Naples. It wasn't the greatest camera work and didn't provide the quality of data I was hoping for, so I waited on putting this part 2 together. Another year went by. Then a second valiant pilot stepped forward. He sent me footage from Hanoi as well as Ho Chi Minh, both in Vietnam. And it all amounted to quite a bit of data and resulted in one sexy-looking spreadsheet. More on that in a sec. For those keenly interested in scientific method in general, I will point out that these two pilots are not aware of one another. So one's data is a completely different source, using the same hardware in different aircraft, with a different airline. And I was never there in person to have any control or influence over the flights. To recap the test, the focus is on calculation of the plane's elevation at 10 miles from the runway, when the GlideScope is giving active feedback about the plane's vertical position on approach. The typical angle of descent is -3 degrees. For this approach into LAX, the air traffic controller vectors the plane to hit the slope at 2,800 feet in elevation as he reaches 10 miles away. Subtract the elevation of the airport runway, and you're looking at the expected figure on the gauge in the cockpit. But until I began to interact with pilot number 2, I didn't fully latch on to the glaring fact that one must use nautical miles in the analysis instead of regular miles. That changes the data result by a whopping 15%. And that's the piece of the puzzle which needed to fit in order to arrive at a correct conclusion. Many thanks to pilot number 2 for mentioning distance measurement in nautical miles. For the lazy who didn't bother to review, the only part of the entire cockpit which will have our eyes is called the primary flight display, or PFD, and one half of that in particular. This is the artificial horizon indicator, along with both speedometers, altimeter, and the 2 localizer guidance systems, one horizontal and one vertical. This test is all about the readings we take from the altimeter while keeping our eye on the GlideScope diamond, so that we know we're taking a precise reading which requires no additional correction. Alrighty, space campers, let's get to the data. Going chronologically, we start in Copenhagen. This is the ideal location since the GlideScope path is completely over the water, at 3.0 degrees descent angle. This is the quality level I was talking about. It took some zooming to get those figures, but the real issues are that he didn't manage to start the recording until he was within 9 miles, and that he didn't quite put the aircraft on the 3-degree centerline of the glide path. And this problem brought about an entire chapter involving a lot of digging to figure out what the incremental angle is above or below the glide path when 1 full dot away from the center. Starting with a random search, I found several pages worth of description of the depth of modulation being the thing which drives the position of the pink diamond on the gauge. But I only found one civilian page where the author went to the effort to precisely quantify it. He indicated that the value was 0.35 degrees to the first dot on 5-dot displays, which is what you find in a current jet cockpit. You will find the one in this image in much slower propeller-driven craft. So I decided to run the numbers on the footage where the diamond is hitting the first dot, and my first round calculation came to 0.38 degrees, which I took to be decent indication of the accuracy of the assertions about 0.35 degrees per dot. However, a second measurement from a different flight came to a result of 0.24 degrees. To find that value, it goes like this. I took a height error measurement just before the measurement in question, when right on the path. I then took that error proportionately down to what it should be when right on the path at the point of the second measurement, deflected by 1 full dot. The difference between the two produced the angle of 0.24 degrees. Naturally, I wanted some official documentation to fall back on in finding a way to increase my confidence in the readings where Pinky's gone wandering. Of course, the FAA is the place to look. Off I went. And it is their rather voluminous publication called the Instrument Flight Handbook which holds the keys to this little mystery. Within its pages, I found the following passage about glide scope mechanics. Considering that this is the organization in which you have entrusted your very lives, I find this language to be pathetically loose in terms of quantification. Aviation thrives and dies on precision and lack thereof. None should be more directly in touch with that fact every single morning they decide to punch their time card at the office. It starts fairly innocently, normally 1.4 degrees. Which parts of the aviation scenario are the normal ones? Which parameters would cause a change in this value? Of course, they don't say. Again, approximately 1,500 feet for the vertical component at 10 nautical miles. Well, this time it turns out that they were only 1% away from the actual value. But we're far from done here. The manual's authors then decide to quantify some part of the plane's descent which will be a constant. Poorly done, guys. They state that the glide scope's centerline, vertically speaking, is about 200 feet above the runway. The truth is that at 3,500 feet on a 3-degree slope, the vertical component is only 183 feet. That's pretty close, you say. In aviation, pretty close simply does not cut wood. Again, approximately 3,500 feet from the runway is where you'll find the middle marker, according to these clowns. Well, let's look at some real-life airport approaches. Of course, to begin with, they've chosen to express that value in a unit of measurement not used in horizontal distance labels on approach diagrams. 3,500 feet comes to 0.58 nautical miles. Let's round that to 0.6 and see where we arrive. Here's one where the distance is only 0.3 miles. This one is 0.5. This one is 1.1 miles. And this one doesn't seem to have one at all. This is the opposite of what the flight manual authors assert to the pilot in training. What a travesty. Well, let's move on past this elevation value that's 8.5% out, and let's leave behind this moronic and fairly irrelevant statement about middle marker distance away from the runway. In the manual's appendix, they make another attempt to quantify the dot error increment value. Firstly, they set up a scenario where the plane is crossing the outer marker at 5.6 nautical miles away and the center of the 3-degree slope is supposedly at an elevation of 1,500 feet. Then they show first and second dot error values of 210 and 420 feet in the vertical. In reality, that elevation of 1,500 feet is actually 1,781, 19% above the quoted value. Application of the 0.35 degrees of error at that distance actually equates to 208 feet. Only 1% away in this case. Not bad. But why didn't they just use 208? If they truly wanted to use rounded figures, they should have started with that value of 5.6 nautical miles. Way to make this as non-intuitive as possible, morons. The bottom line here is that we have two sources which seem to agree that the first dot of error's value is 0.35 degrees. And that seems to be enough to feel fairly confident about their assertion that this is how their gear is calibrated. But the question of cause for this range in result from 0.24 to 0.38 comes to the front. That takes me one step away from the problem to look at the mechanisms at work behind the gauges we're consulting. The glidescope signals all involve light traveling from the ground to the craft. Very tight. Instantaneous, you might say. But that's not the case with the altimeter. I think we're looking at a problem which involves the variable of response time between change in elevation and change in readout. Naturally, my next move was to check for relation between rate of descent and percent error in the reading against the pure math. I'm pretty sure that nothing exists in the flight manual regarding response time of the altimeter. At this point, we're making correction to the correction value. This is where the problem is consumed by a plurality of margins of error. It amounts to far too much variability from craft to craft, manufacturer to manufacturer, in order to confidently assert a precise elevation figure. So I decided to only put confidence in readings where the jet is right on the glide path, pink diamond right on the zero line. For Copenhagen, when reaching 8.0 and 7.0 miles away, Pinky wasn't quite lined up. That leaves us with solid data beginning 6 miles away, and that's not really a large enough range between maximum and minimum expected figures. At 8 miles, we're talking about a 56-foot difference. Regardless of data quality, let's go through how this looks when graphed. Of the three values, I put the actual reading as the middle of the three values to more easily visually determine whether the figure is closer to the flat Earth elevation dictated by the math, or that elevation with added curvature at 8 inches per squared regular mile. At 8 and 7 miles away, I'm showing an educated, uncorrected guess. By the time we get onto the glide path, you can see at 6 miles where the reading falls right in between the two. And the three values are quite close together at this scale. So I also graphed the readings as a percentage of the flat Earth math expected figures, no curvature added. Remember, 8 and 7 were a guess, and 6 is a little closer to flat than the 8 inches of curvature. As we go to the right, the instrument's margin of error starts to swallow the range, so we can't draw any real conclusions solely from this sample. And the next one, unfortunately, doesn't seem to improve our chances of making one. Here we are in Naples, and pilot number 1 has managed to begin the recording from more than 12 miles out. Fantastic. But he just wasn't on the glide path until 6 miles away. At 9 miles, the co-pilot wasn't holding the camera where a proper reading could be taken. So we're doing some guessing all the way down until we get to 6 miles. From there on, it's looking like Earth's surface is pretty flat. Because the shape is so different from the first, in order to see how finely we're really slicing this, I also began to check whether topography may have had an influence over the altimeter. In Naples, we hit land at about 8 miles out, so I put the percentage figures across the land elevation using Google Earth as a reference. But don't let that steep-looking line give you the wrong impression. Every vertical line to the right we go, that's 1.15 miles, as opposed to a mere 100 feet per horizontal line. That's compressing real slope by 60 to 1. Even at a rise of 500 feet in a half mile, we're only talking about a 16.5% gradient. In any case, when over the ocean until 8 miles away, it appears that topography is not affecting the instrument at this location. That takes us to our second valiant hero, doing some puddle jumping in Vietnam. I really want to tell you all about this guy. Both of them, frankly, but that would most likely endanger their careers. Just off the top, I will say that I'm extremely happy with his camera placement. Excellent work. Starting off in approach to Hanoi, it was quite fortunate that he managed to start the recording a fair bit farther out than 10 nautical miles. The result is that he managed to hit the glide path at 10.7, where we got a solid reading. It then matters somewhat less that he wasn't quite on the glide path for 10, 9, and 8 miles away. When looking at the percentages, I'm seeing how my guesses were likely a bit on the high side, given that the rest of the readings were 92 to 95% of a flat value. The topographical analysis on this one isn't worth much of an inspection. The land is essentially level for the entire span. It's what I would expect to see given only the confident readings. On the whole, the Hanoi data looks like it's pointing towards a flat surface conclusion. So let's move on. Here we are on approach to Ho Chi Minh City. A bit of a late start, but he started to hit it at 9.6 miles away. 97.1% of expected for flat. No guesses with these readings. Very clear recording. Percentages of expected come right down to 91% by the time we hit 3 miles away, but that's not critical when we have focus on the 10-mile mark, and 9.6 is pretty close. We have a couple of small hills on the way in from 5 miles out, again, not the end of the graph that we're closely examining. Topography here also appears not to be an influence. Once again, all values well under the flat expected figures. But with a drift of 6% over 7 miles, I'm left wanting more data. I want to see if the aircraft will give me consistent figures. Isn't that what science is all about? Most fortunately, this hero delivered. Our second approach to Ho Chi Minh, he scores readings from 10 down to 6 miles right on the line. God bless autopilot. Again, well under flat Earth expected figures. On this second run, the slope of drift seems to be about the same. That adds to the confidence level of the dataset. And then, lightning strikes for a third time. Here we are on a third approach to Ho Chi Minh. He hit the glide path at 10.7 miles out this time, which is even better than hitting the mark at 10.0, the one data point on this approach which necessitated a guess. The rest are also right on the line from 9.2 down to 5 miles, but it's the first and third ones which make the strongest mathematical case. This time, a 4% drift over 6 miles, all well below flat territory, and again, the guess seems to be the only data point I would consider throwing out. Even then, it's pretty close to the rest. When we see 3 consecutive approaches where the readings as a percentage of expected all have essentially the same slope, we start to look for the cause. To me, it looks like the altimeter is again the place we should be looking. My first thought was that this drift in the data could very well be caused by the very increase in air density over time where elevation is dropping to near zero. The highest rate of increase in air pressure per vertical foot being at zero. Considering that the typical approach rate of descent is fairly constant at roughly 700 or 800 feet per minute, I wondered whether this curve in rate of change of air pressure is the thing causing the increase in downward slope of the drift itself. And the altimeter seems to be not able to fully recover from the lag until a decrease in rate of descent. A reading which gave an angle of 0.24 degrees was taken while descending at 1,300 feet per minute at an elevation of 2850, while 1 full dot below the center of the glide path. That's quite the clip at such a low elevation. And I think we're seeing precisely that in our imprecise altimeter readings. But this is all splitting hairs. Hairs? Hairs. 6 approaches later, we haven't seen a single confidently acquired data point from the expected figure anywhere near 10 miles away from the runway. I am elated to be able to tell you that I'm about to deliver. Or rather, pilot number 2 is. Fasten your safety belts, space campers. Speaking of readings at better than 10 nautical miles away from the runway, now that we've got a solid reading from 10.7 miles away, just how much farther out is it possible to catch the glide path's signals? Feast your eyes, ladies and gentlemen, globies and flirts alike. Here he is, intercepting the HCM runway localizer radar at a staggering 130 nautical miles out from the airport. The radar scale on the right only shows the next 80 miles, because that scale shows everything he'll come across for the next 5 minutes. But we don't see the glide scope diamond, just the localizer arrow to the extreme left showing us that he's yet to cross the center line on the runway heading from his position. Looks like he's got to get a little closer. He is, after all, 36,000 feet above ground. He manages to pick up the glide scope radar at 59 miles away. Now you can see the first few yards of the runway location on the radar screen poking through the 60-mile line, at a heading of roughly 240 degrees from his current position. You can also see that he's already set up the autopilot heading of 250 for hitting the runway, just under 15,000 feet up. And this is the moneymaker, right on the glide path at 35 nautical miles away from the runway. And Pinky is right on the line. A nice slow rate of descent on the reading, less than half of the feet per minute rate when following the slope of the glide path itself. So we're getting a nice tight measurement as he rolls out of a left turn. Negligible altimeter lag. On the radar, putting the airport off the right wing, you can see that 35 is well outside the scale on the right side of the screen. Putting 11,020 into the original equation, along with the 35 nautical miles, we arrive at 2.97 degrees. Swapping out the vertical figure for the angle of precisely 3 degrees, we see that we were only 110 feet under the expected flat Earth figure. We missed the bullseye by a single percentage point. And that could be very well attributed to the old altimeter's recovery time at 300 feet per minute. For reference, the Globey curvature added figure is more than 1,000 feet above. In review, all we did was inclusively utilize a long-established, ubiquitously used piece of necessarily very precisely tuned radar technology to produce a known slope against which we plotted distance to the ground from a commercial jet flown by a trained professional. From those data points, we plotted a contour. To me, the data makes a pretty ironclad case. Sorry, Globies. The data consistently points towards flat. Thanks for watching.